started, if you could just introduce yourself, and then if you maybe want to start from maybe your transition from high school to college, and then kind of your experience there, and then we'll just go. I really want to just, learn about you and kind of your ups and downs, and I'll let you lead. So.
For sure, for sure. Let's see. Well, so my family moved to the Philippines when I was like around 4 years old, 4 or 5. So I went to school in Cebu City in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
I am not Filipino at all by ethnicity. My stepmom's Filipina, but so I do feel very Filipino in terms of culture.
Yeah.
I lived there till I was 19.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was a huge shift in terms of like kind of that high school experience.
Mm-hmm.
Full disclosure, I was actually held back in the second grade because I visited too much.
Oh.
And I ended up skipping fourth and fifth grade because
Wow.
I did that. Yeah. So I always say, the kids that always get in trouble for talking too much end up, getting paid to talk later on in life. Yeah, so I went to high school in the Philippines, which is a very different experience than here in the States, from what I gather. I spent 2 semesters of college in the Philippines. I started when I was my first semester of high school when I was 16, going on 17 years old, which I don't recommend that. It probably would have been better if like my parents just had me wait till I turned 18, 19. But I always thought I was going to go into foreign service. Growing up in the Philippines and traveling around Southeast Asia, I became really obsessed with foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that when I was 14 years old, I tried to get a fake ID in the Philippines so I could vote, which is really illegal.
Yeah.
Especially because not only was I underage, but I wasn't a Filipino citizen.
Oh.
But this was during a period where the president of the Philippines was extremely corrupt. And it was later on found out that these assumptions about corruption were true. Long story short, I've been politically active most of my life. And I have my father to really thank for that. But yeah, so my major when I was in college was political science. Mm-hmm. And what I learned though is that in the Philippines, I was studying, Filipino politics and history and learning about just how much colonization took place on that one little island from the Spanish to the Japanese to the Americans. It's a frustrating and sad and yet very rich history. And coming back to the States when I was 19, I had planned to continue in political science and then eventually, take the Foreign Service exam. But I ended up accidentally working for AmeriCorps, as you do, right? And it completely changed the trajectory of my life. I realized that I loved youth work. And after one summer of working at the Eco-Justice Farm in Racine County and meeting a couple of the nuns there, and it also changed my mind completely about like nuns and realizing like back in the day that was one of the most rebellious things you could do is to like, go against the grain and say, no, I'm not going to just go get married and have kids. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but these women were, they were kick-ass. They are kick-ass.
Yeah.
So coming back to the States, I realized I was really behind in understanding American politics. And 2, I realized that I had more of a passion for understanding how society worked rather than how politics worked. Mm-hmm. So because I figured if I could understand how social norms were developed, how society's norms and expectations were developed, that would help me understand politics more. So I switched my major to sociology. Okay. And then the rest is kind of history from there.
Wow. I had no idea. I think you'd mentioned that you grew up in the Philippines, but could you touch a bit more? You talked about how your high school experience was very different from maybe an American high school experience. Could you touch a bit on that?
Yeah, well, one of the main differences in going to school in a developing country is that for my junior and sophomore year, I believe, we didn't have a classroom. So when it would rain, class would be canceled. So that was one. I went to, public school in the Philippines, where everyone wore uniforms, even though, even in public schools there, which is different than here in the States. And I definitely stood out like a sore thumb. I don't look Filipina. I would say Cebuano and Tagalog are probably my primary languages, even though I technically, I guess, am a native English speaker, but I didn't really speak it for most of my life in my young adulthood or teenagehood, I guess I could say, my adolescence. So there is that aspect to it. The Philippines is also predominantly Catholic. So there's kind of this interesting dynamics, at least when I hadn't been back since 2009, but when I did live there, there seemed to be this very interesting dynamic between Muslim Filipinos and Catholic Filipinos. So much so that a lot of the policies and politics were absolutely informed by Catholicism, even though the country does not have like a state religion, which was also very interesting to me as the daughter of a Jew.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. All.
Right. Having like my dad's Jewish, my stepmom's Roman Catholic, my birth mom, who passed away when I was little, was a Unitarian. And so I grew up in a household that was very much so about like religious freedom and education. And even if you didn't follow religion, that's cool too. It was like your spirituality, so to speak, your morality was seen as something separate from like a religious practice. And my dad always said that, religion is a personal thing. And so he encouraged us to do our own exploration. So, to this day, I probably consider myself a spiritual mutt. But I just remember being in high school and having this class called values class. And it was basically religion. And thinking about how, wow, like this would never fly in the States. But now considering a current climate, I'm like, maybe. So yeah, so those would be the two differences, of course. Probably because of the whole Catholicism thing, I think the Philippines is actually even though it's very Catholic, it is a very matriarchal society. The Philippines has had, I think, 2 or 3 female presidents already. So in that regard, they're very advanced. But there is still this underlying kind of machismo, patriarchy around like, women and their bodies being, and values around that. So that was an interesting dynamic where, yeah, even like normally, like here in the States, it's very normal to like go on dates when you're like 14, 15 years old. Like I didn't go on a date till I was like 22, 23, yeah. And then there's, yeah. So, it's like a little bit of a late bloomer. But I still think what I loved about, I think, growing up in the Philippines was, and having the family that I have, is that it allowed me to see that, wow, like, okay, a Black Jew, a Filipino Catholic can make this work, right? And can raise kids effectively. And because of that, like, why can't the rest of the world get it together? But I think it also informed my perspective around like diversity, because I grew up it was, so for example, most Americans, I feel, grow up in a household that's pretty homogenous. Like most of the folks practice the same religion, they have similar ethnicities. Not that they're on blended families and biracial, multiracial families, but for the most part, most of us grow up where we share rather the same identity as our parents and as our siblings, and that was just not my case. And because of that, it allowed me to see at a very young age it's absolutely possible to love and respect other people and not see their perspectives as an affront on your own. So yeah.
That's awesome. I wish there was a way like break that cycle of the like more homogenous, not that anything's bad with them, but it's just like it obviously helped you as a young child to like better understand and see diversity versus like now a lot of kids either will never see it or they have to unlearn learn things.
Right.
Yeah.
exactly. That unlearning, I think, is really integral. I think a lot of us, we don't know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of us, based on how we're raised, we follow our parents' religion. So whatever, for better or for worse, um, we kind of get stuck in this lockstep thing. And the Midwest is really notorious for that, which is why I feel like it's sad to see us. We have a lot of brain drain, I feel, here, especially brain drain amongst people of color, because they just find that it's really hard to kind of break through that glass ceiling. And not that coastal cities don't have their own issues, because we know they do, but yeah, that is something I think about a lot when I think about Milwaukee. And I think about how many of my colleagues have like left the city. But I will say that, some of them are coming back too, and they're realizing, you know what, like, yeah, I could go be a small fish in New York, or I could really make an impact here in my own city. Or
Mm-hmm.
people who are coming into Milwaukee from other places and seeing Milwaukee without those kind of blinders on, and seeing it for what it could be and what it is. And so I think that's cool too.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Could you touch on what made you leave the Philippines when you were, I think, 19?
Yeah. So during this time, there was a pretty significant Muslim uprising, and there was a group called the Abu Sayyaf that was linked to Al Qaeda. And one of my friends who in college was actually Muslim herself, and she went back home to Mindanao and ended up getting kidnapped. And Mindanao is a southern island in the Philippines that's predominantly Islamic. And if you don't know a whole lot about like the Philippines, for quite a long time, up through I would say the mid '90s, a lot of the government was not very kind to the Islamic islands, and to the point where they would oftentimes send teachers who were Catholic to Muslim areas. Like you couldn't be a teacher. This is all kind of unspoken or sorry, it's spoken. It wasn't like a documented thing, but it was a common practice that most Filipinos were aware of. In fact, to the point where if you were to read a news article, for example, and let's say there was a Muslim man being accused of something, the news article would say Muslim man accused of blah blah blah, just like kind of like in the 50s and 60s, where they would say a black man accused of blah blah blah. But like if it was like a white person, it would just be like a man, you know. So I think also seeing just like this very real like post-colonial mentality play out in modern times, so to speak, was interesting. But so anyway, so when my friend was kidnapped, her family was able to get her back, but as you can probably imagine, during this period of time, things were just never the same. And it was very common for foreigners, even journalists, unfortunately, to be kidnapped by copycat Islamic groups, because it's my understanding that the original Abu Sayyaf was not engaging in things like that. They were trying to get their message heard about feeling disempowered through the government. But eventually, violence started kind of taking over, and people were being beheaded, and my dad was like, okay,
Oh.
back it up.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we had a good run. But interestingly, a few years later, once that kind of shifted, my parents felt comfortable enough to send my younger sister and brother there to go to school for high school. So it didn't, my family still has property there. We own a farm, actually a couple farms, and some property in the city. So my brother lives there now. He manages our farm up in Alaginsan. So, I think my dad at the moment was just kind of feeling like it's a little hot right now. We should probably move the kids back home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then, so you came back to Milwaukee?
No, so I came back to Racine.
Oh,
My
okay.
family originally from Madison, but my parents, speaking of being like a big fish in a smaller pond, my dad and my birth mom moved to Racine in the 70s when they realized that they could, make a better living, and have a lower cost of living,
Mm-hmm.
which was not at all, was not a welcome thing. My birth mom was this, green-eyed, blonde-haired woman. My dad was dark as night, this tall, big black guy. Racine was not having it. And it didn't help that my parents owned an adult bookstore and a tavern
Amazing.
in a little small town, like conservative Racine. So, um, but, you know, and then after that, you know, once they had me and my older sister Joy, my dad and my birth mom kind of decided we should probably go more into real estate since we have these two little girls. You know, let's switch up our model here. But yeah, so when my mom passed away when I was little, my dad, the parents were separated already at this point, but my dad remarried a Filipina, and so that's how we ended up going to the Philippines. But so coming back, I was in Racine. I finished up college at UW Parkside. And I remember going on campus and thinking, one, like, wow, I won't get into any trouble here because there's nothing around here for me to like do. And I was so determined also to like graduate college without like any, or at least not a lot of student debt. So I stayed at home. I rented one of my parents' apartment buildings and just paid for school with either cash or any grants that I got or some scholarships. And luckily was able to graduate with only like, I think 17 grand in debt. So yeah, you know, and well, here's the thing. I was determined to not leave with a lot of debt because I had no intentions of making a lot of money after I graduated. Because I knew I was, once I had the experience of being in AmeriCorps, I realized I discovered kind of the nonprofit world, and that impacted me a lot. And I realized I love working with young people. I love being in nature. But I knew that those types of careers didn't pay a whole lot until you maybe became an executive director. And I wasn't quite sure if that's what I wanted to do anyways, because I wanted to still be close to the work. And so, yeah, so I definitely had this mindset that I was going to work in nonprofit forever and that was just going to be it. And then as I started to learn more about how nonprofits operate, I realized, oh, this is just like another business. Like, you know, you realize that there's a whole lot of poverty pimping that happens in the nonprofit world. And that didn't sit well with me.
Could you unpack that a little bit? The poverty pimping you said?
Sure. So anecdotally, I would find myself in these situations where I would have to parade around funders to like the brown and black kids in my program and basically like have them tell their sad sap story, you know, and how we're helping these poor little kids. And there was one moment where I realized we had, for example, there's a group of siblings who were in our program, the Washingtons. I'm still close with them today. They might be watching right now. I don't know. But it was like these 5, you know, siblings. All of them had gone through one of our programs. And I felt a lot of pressure to kind of push them up front as like our golden children. But here's the thing, Tara. These kids were going to be great regardless if they were in. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, their parents were just kick ass. Like they're, I don't believe there's any such thing as like bad kids, but these kids were like on the right track regardless of who they were going to be around. And it felt really gross and really just not okay to try to capitalize on that and present that as though that was something we were doing. So, and that was kind of the breaking point for me. But also the main reason why I ended up leaving the nonprofit world to start Cream City Conservation was that I realized that there are oftentimes people making decisions in higher positions that are not on the ground, who don't really have the full landscape, which is what happened. And back in, early 2016, I was, you know, called into our like Midwest headquarters in Chicago for what I thought was actually going to be a conversation about a raise. Because I felt like I'd done so well in like building partnerships and bringing in money for the program, even though that wasn't necessarily my job. I wasn't a fundraiser. I was in, you know, program management. And when they told me they were shutting down both the Milwaukee and the Detroit programs, my first response was laughter, because I'm the type of person where when there's a catastrophe, like my initial response is like, of course, as you do, like, like, you know, I don't know. I'm the type of person that just is terrible at funerals because, yeah, I just have this like nervous laughter thing, but I'm really good under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But then I fall apart like a few days later.
Does,
That being said, when that happened, I was shocked because as I was looking at our numbers, I thought, well, we're doing fine financially. Why would they, shut us down? And so later on, a few weeks later, I sent an email to the president at the time saying, hey, we've got these other partnerships in the works that, based on my calculations, would keep us afloat for at least the next 2 years. I don't know if that's not enough to like keep the program going, but, and long story short, I was told, well, yeah, we're kind of thinking about a different direction, which I don't know what that meant.
yeah.
Long story short, I ended up, the organizations that wrote us into the grants reached out to me and said, hey, would you be willing to run a crew just to fulfill these grant obligations that your old organization is no longer able to fulfill? Now, by
Mm-hmm.
this point, I was already working at the Parks Department. Like I knew I was going to could always find a job. Like I knew I was marketable. So I never worried about that, which seems really egotistical to say out loud, but I just figured
Also
like,
earn that too, though.
what's that?
Earn that. I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah. And I also figured like, I live fairly below my means. So I wasn't, I think if I had a family and I had kids and maybe I'd be more concerned, but I'm like, as long as I have a steady stream of ice cream coming in my life, like I'm okay. But yes, I was working for the Parks Department already, and that offer came, and I thought, well, sure. I mean, I already have connections to these young people; they know what to do, and so we bought some tools. We got them. It was basically just a continuation of what we were already doing, and that just kind of ballooned into something else. Where I realized, it would be great if these organizations actually could develop their own pathways into conservation. I don't know if I really said what I do, but you know, so I should be clear too that in the very beginning, I had no intention of ever getting into the conservation or environmental field. In fact, what drew me to it was the opportunity to work with young people because I'm an educator at heart, and that's I joke sometimes that I would be happy selling pencils on the side of North Avenue with teenagers. Like I love working with teens. They are just brilliant. I love that you can have like real conversations with them, and yet they are young enough to be open-minded, not yet jaded about the world, and also old enough where they can do something about what they care about. And I learn more probably from the young people in my life than I do any university course I've ever taken, to be quite honest. I mean, granted, that could be because my major is sociology. It's like if you love to read, you can pretty much create your own master's program. But yeah, so.
Wow. So what do you do with Cream City Conservation and when did you start it?
So I started Cream City Conservation Corps first in 2016 in August. And we applied for like a LLC in September or October 2016. And initially it was intended to be this continuation of my old job, which was engaging young people in hands-on service to public lands. So basically cultivating a crew that would work and do, land restoration, tree planting, trail building, things like that. But then I realized that if we're not simultaneously getting young people of color excited about the environment and about those career fields, while also preparing the existing industry for this new generation of environmentalists, all of that's going to be for nothing. And I say this because as my staff of color were working in other spaces, as my teens were graduating out of the program, and I would find out sometimes from them, sometimes from other people that they decided to go into a different industry because they were experiencing a lot of micro and macroaggressions, and didn't quite have the language to communicate their needs, and also felt like there wasn't a point. Like they felt like the problem was just too ingrained and too big for them to manage because oftentimes they were the only person of color in the organization. They were young, and they just felt like they didn't have a lot of power and a lot of clout.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I would talk to some like environmental groups, their question was always, well, how are you getting all these people of color, August, to be crew leaders? And like, where are you finding all your teens from? Because we thought, city teens could care less about the environment. And, there's a lot of myths about young people, about people of color. And so I thought, one, we need to start dispelling some of these myths. And two, we need to start looking at the cultures that are creating this very racially homogenous institution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I kind of brought it out and added on the consulting leg. And with that, what I started doing was, rather than simply doing fee for service conservation crews, I would use the profits from the consulting to offset the cost of doing additional trainings and, like, recreation type activities for the crew members. Because at that point, my groceries were paid for by, like, my job at the parks department.
Mm-hmm.
And I was married at the time, so like, I wasn't missing any meals. And it never was intended to be my full-time job. It was going to be like this passion project that maybe I did for a little while, and it would be cute and it'd be done. And yeah, it's not done. And here we are in 2020, still going. Yeah.
That's awesome. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've touched a lot on a little bit about your like personal experiences, a lot about career-wise, but I'd love to touch a bit more on like the personal side, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, of course.
How you've been able to navigate your like personal ups and downs, on top of the career trajectory, mistrajectory, whatever,
Yeah.
the road
Yeah.
of life, basically.
I think everybody's got a story, right? As I'm sure you doing this work, you've heard so many people's stories. And one thing that I've learned over time, I'm 37 now, one thing I've learned is that the obstacle is the advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, what I've always thought was going to be my demise ended up being like this fire starter, or this extra push that I needed to accomplish something.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, starting off by being, Black and mixed race, like, one would think that that would be like a hindrance, because you feel, oftentimes people who are mixed race might feel like they don't belong in either side, when we're thinking of our identities from like a binary, standard. Growing up in a foreign country where, I had to learn the language and then had to relearn English coming back. All of those things turned out to be like a benefit in the long run. When I, just in the past few years alone, I work was getting really stressful, because I when I do things, I want to do them big and I want to do them impactfully. And what I realized was I was really pouring my heart and soul into, like, my passion project, which is Cream City Conservation. And I realized I wasn't really showing up in my marriage.
Mm.
I think sometimes we take folks for granted. We think, oh, this person will be here, right? Well, I remember going through my second miscarriage, and it was during summer, and I had to go to work the next day. Like, I wasn't going to not show up to work, and I just didn't tell anybody. And those were the kinds of things. And I think there's also this kind of like white dominant culture component that we have to overwork, and, like, especially as women, we got to overperform and be perfectionists, and that doesn't do anybody any services. I'm realizing, like, it's okay to let people see you crack every once in a while. Like, it's okay to show your humanity, because you give other people permission to, like, also, like, show their humanity. Anyway, so because I think I had gone, like, my birth mom was murdered when I was 4. So there was that. Like, I had gone through, I think, so much adversity by the time I was, like, in my late 20s, that every time something bad would happen, I'd just be like, okay, like, it just, you just learn to disassociate yourself from it. And I don't know if that's necessarily healthy. It's what was required for me to, to stay sane and to continue moving forward. But I think the shadow side of that is that it made me the type of person that can go through a very traumatic event and then just kind of have a quick cry and then get right back on the horse. And I think you do that enough times, you start to kind of disconnect your body a bit. So anyways, fast forward to, you know, being married, and, you know, my husband at the time, you know, his dream was to have some kids, have a nice yard, call
Mhm.
it a day, right? And my thing was like, I want to change the world of conservation. Like I want to put Milwaukee on the map for being the comeback kid, for taking, you know, the city with the worst racial disparities ever and make it the best, you know, like, so we were just not aligned. And like, not that these were things he didn't care about, but like we were just not aligned in like what we thought we were going to accomplish in our lifetime.
Mhm.
And so all that came to head one night when I was on my, you know, my 7th week of working 72 hours a week, where he was just like, I'm out, kid. You know. And and that was really rough. So
Mhm.
I moved out. I continued, and I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I need to get health insurance. I got to continue. I'm gonna have to start paying myself more so I can like live. Now that I don't have this, you know, 2-person income, I instantly like went into like problem solving mode, you know. And I did that first by like, you know what, I'm going to get on the next plane to wherever it's going, and I spent like 2.5 months just traveling, you know, and living in hostels. I recommend every woman go travel by themselves too, by the way. I don't care. Like, don't feel like money is the barrier. Not to say that like things don't cost money, but like if anyone is looking for travel tips for cheap, hit me up. I
Yeah.
think I've figured it all out. Anyway, yeah, so got my own place, moved out, and then my aunt in the Philippines, my step aunt, who basically raised me from when I was 4 till I was 12, because my parents came back to the States. They left my sister and I, Joy, in the Philippines, and they would come visit every few years. I'm sorry, every few months. So my mama Feely, she passed away from a stroke a few months after that. And then a few weeks later, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer.
Oh my God.
COVID happened, and it was just like, y'all playing. You
Yeah.
know, it was like, what is this life?
Yeah.
I mean, I can laugh about it now, but I was just like, you know, like, what can you do? It was one of those moments where like I would literally go from like wanting to cry to just like hysterical laughing, because I'm like, you can't make this up. And then I was like, and murder hornets, of course. But, you know, again, what I realized in all of this, though, is that every single thing in life, that I thought would break me, from losing my birth mom to losing my aunt. Mind you, on top of all this, like my parents and I, my dad and my stepmom, like we haven't spoken in 5 years, and that's because they, you know, of a lot of things. But you know, so they had some concerns around, you know, my ex-husband was a detective, and so my dad, being, you know, a Black man, having gone through all of the systemic issues and racism, was kind of like, really, kid, like, you know, I mean, that was one part of it. But you know, just my point in this is that everything literally that, like, had you asked me, you know, 8 years ago, like, what would be the breaking point that would put you in a straitjacket in a pink room, like, all that's happened. And I'm like, oh, okay, like, that sucks, but I'm still here, and life's not over, and I can write this story however I want. um, it's shown me that, like, I am far stronger than I ever thought I would be. And it's because the obstacles have proven to be the advantage. Like, I knew I had no other option but to like make stuff work. And I also think that the universe conspires. Like, when you make a decision to make something happen, like
Mhm.
when I just sent, when I first started Cream City Conservation, I sent out an email to everybody in the environmental industry in Milwaukee that I knew, saying, hey, I'm working at the Parks Department, but I've got these young teens who still want to stay involved with conservation work. If you need somebody, or if you need somebody to come in and give a presentation on like how to, you know, be more culturally responsive with your risk management when you're trying to engage young people of color in the outdoors, like, hit me up. And that's literally all I did. Like, I have yet to advertise. Every single one of my clients is word of mouth, and I've got clients from the Nature Conservancy to the U.S. Forest Service, the DNR, you know, MMSD, you know, all around the Midwest and in California. And it's literally just been all word of mouth. And I will say that's one of the benefits of Milwaukee being so small. The benefit is that it does not take a long time to build up a positive reputation.
Mhm.
in that same breath,
Yeah.
you can lose that trust in an instant. So that's probably one of my fears, but I'm leaning and I'm banking on, like, as long as I focus on the impact that I'm having, and I really think about things intentionally, I think I'll be okay, right? That doesn't mean I'm going to do things perfectly all the time, which I will say to that end, when you do make a mistake, like a simple "my bad" goes a long way, not only with other adults, but even with teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Just it's amazing to me to realize how many of our young adults, and maybe you've experienced this too, Tara, but how many of us have never heard an adult apologize to us?
Yeah.
You know, um,
Our parents too.
right? You know, because and it all comes down to power, right? Which is also the source of a lot of, like, issues, is that people are hoarding power,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I find that, so for example, like, even the name Cream City Conservation, that came up, that was born out of the students from my old conservation program,
Mm-hmm.
because we had a crew that wanted to see how much carbon emissions they could reduce by biking to their park instead of using vehicles, using like our rental vans.
Mm-hmm.
And they jokingly would refer to themselves as Cream City Conservation Cycle or Cream City Cycle. And so when that came up, I thought, that's actually a really good name. I should, like, you know, once that program was done, I thought I should name, like, my company Cream City Conservation, and no one else apparently had done that yet. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Wow.